centuries ago, the Russian Tsar, Peter the Great, issued an edict to his subjects. He instructed them to collect...
from earth and water, old inscriptions, ancient weapons, dishes, and everything old and unusual.
Among the curiosities brought to his attention were some priceless golden objects, necklaces, belts, combs, beakers and helmets, many of them decorated with fantastic beasts or scenes of combat. The decorations were very different from the usual European wear. It was said they came from ancient burial sites somewhere in the south or east of Russia. But who were the enigmatic people who created these delicate treasures? Where did they come from? And why did they bury their precious artefacts in the ground in the first place? That's what we'll be finding out in today's forum from the BBC World Service with me, Bridget Kendall. It took many decades to work out that these magnificent objects, now mostly found in Russian and Ukrainian museums, came from a group of nomadic tribes that we call the Scythians, or in other languages, Scythians. In the first millennium BC, they inhabited a vast territory, stretching from the borders of Mongolia in East Asia all the way to the Black Sea coast of Eastern Europe. What we know about the Scythians has changed a lot since the era of Peter the Great and that collecting spree, and it's still evolving as archaeologists and geneticists keep making new discoveries. So to find out what the current thinking is, I'm joined by three experts on Scythian archaeology. Dr. Margarita Gleba from the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, Professor Hermann Parzinger, President of the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation, and Professor Sir Barry Cunliffe from Oxford University. Now, the Scythians are hard to pin down, not just because they flourished over an extremely large area and a very long time ago, but also because they left no written documents. So, Barry, what are the main sources of our knowledge about them?
Well, what makes the Scythians so interesting is that we've got a variety of sources. The most important, I think, and we as archaeologists would say that, is the archaeological evidence, the really hard data that we find from excavations, particularly of their burial mounds, which are called kurgans. There are hundreds of thousands of kurgans, and many of them have been excavated over the last 200-300 years. So we have a lot of data from those burials. We also have, of course, texts from observers of the Scythians. As you said, we don't have texts from themselves, but people who observe them, mostly Greek texts. Herodotus, the father of history, wrote extensively about the Scythians, and he probably came into contact with them and certainly talked to some. So his evidence is broadly contemporary, dates to the 5th century BC, and quite a lot of other stuff. Even Homer mentions mare milkers on the steppe on the north side of the Black Sea. But in addition to that, we've also got some Assyrian texts, cuneiform texts, because the Scythians came up against the Assyrians in Asia Minor. And then just finally, we've got images that the Persians carved of Scythians, and images which the Greeks made for the Scythians of themselves and of their way of life. So a lot of data, and the beauty is that you can compare one lot with another and balance out what is fact and what is fiction.
Well, we'll come back to those written sources in a moment. But first, let's talk a little bit more about the burial sites, these kurgans. As you said, there are thousands of them scattered through the grasslands where the Scythians flourished, both in the Pontic steppe in modern-day Ukraine, and further east in the foothills of the Caucasus, and further east still in the mountain valleys of the Altai range between Russia and China. Margarita, what does a typical kurgan look like, and what's inside?
Well, the tricky answer to this question is that there is no typical kurgan, but essentially a kurgan is an artificial mound that would have been constructed over a pit dug into the ground to contain a burial. And depending on the geographical area, you just mentioned that they stretched over a very wide area, the period and the status of the deceased, the size, the complexity and the inventory of a kurgan would have varied quite substantially. So effectively no two kurgans are alike. Most of them would have been fairly simple and small, rarely exceeding 1 meter in height and just a few meters in diameter. They would have contained only one, possibly two burials, possibly a horse, and some weapons and vessels. But at the other end of the spectrum, we have the few monumental giant kurgans, the so-called royal mounds, that especially in the 4th century BC in the Pontic region, can reach over 20 meters in height. That's a 5-story building, and over 80 meters in diameter. That's almost like a football pitch. And they would contain multiple human burials, horse burials, human sacrifices, as well as a very wide range of rich burial goods, gold, weapons, vessels, trappings of horses, and so on. And the curious thing about this is that we're only recently starting to understand how complex the architecture of these giant kurgans was. The re-excavation of Alexandropol, one of the largest royal Scythian mounds excavated in the 19th century, in fact, it was the first scientifically excavated Scythian kurgan, has shown that it was constructed in very specific stages. First, there was a ring ditch that was dug around the area of the future mound. Then the funeral pit itself was excavated that would contain the main burial of the Scythian royal couple, lavishly dressed and likely containing a huge amount of weapons, vessels, and other burial goods. Unfortunately, the burial was robbed in antiquity, so we don't know, in fact, what was there. But it was surrounded by 15 horse burials. Then the catacomb was covered by the earthen part of the mound using pieces of turf that would have been excavated from the surrounding steppe. And to do that, an area about 65 hectares would have had to be excavated to create this mound that was about 130,000 cubic meters, so a huge undertaking. At the end, this would have been covered with a stone coat and the foundation protected with giant 4-meter slabs of stone. And finally, the kurgan would have been surrounded by a ditch 4 meters deep and another wall on the outside of that would have been, again, about 1 meter or 2 tall. So the whole affair would have taken about 6 to 7 months to complete and involved probably between 4,000 and 6,000 people.
Well, as you mentioned, Margarita, as well as human remains, archaeologists have often found horses inside the kurgans, sometimes a dozen horse skeletons, or sometimes more than 100. We know that the domesticated horse was crucial to the Scythian way of life since they were nomads, herders and breeders. But Hermann, how much do we know about why they would sacrifice and bury these horses in these kurgans?
Well, all what they had in the grave was their belongings, and their property in a way was also reflecting their status. And we have huge elite kurgans, for example in Ajan in southern Siberia, where there are more than 200 horses. There are others which have less, and for example a simple normal warrior which had just a dagger and a pot had, for example, 1 horse in the burial chamber or just beside the burial chamber. So the number of horses, in a way, is reflecting the status, the social status of the warriors. And, for example, when we excavated a huge kurgan in southern Siberia in Ajan, we found 14 horses, and we did the old DNA, and these 14 horses belong to 12 different haplotypes. This means 14 horses from 12 different herds. And the horses, measuring and analyzing all the anatomy, have been in the best age, very strong horses. So it was not the way that they said, well, we have to sacrifice horses, let's take a few old ones, which are almost useless, but they selected really the best horses, the youngest, the strongest horses from different herds, really to sacrifice them in the grave of such a, let's say, elite Scythian king or whatever.
Many of the kurgans had been looted well before modern-day archaeologists like yourselves, or even 18th and 19th century collectors had a chance to excavate the sites. But even though only a fraction of the Scythian precious objects inside these burial sites remain, it's enough to demonstrate one thing, that the Scythians seem to have been particularly fond of gold. And Margarita, some of these Scythian gold objects have become really quite famous and very intricate. I believe in some graves there have been several thousand gold objects of all kinds and sizes.
Indeed, the burials that have not been looted often contain thousands of golden objects, and these can range from tiny plaques that have decorated the garments of the buried men and women, and sometimes there are literally thousands of them just on a single person, to quite large vessels, personal ornaments, and particularly weapons that are, I think, rightly regarded today as some of the most spectacular pieces of art ever produced by human hands. And many of them are, of course, decorated with the so-called animal style, showing the stylized Eurasian wild animals such as stags, leopards, wild boars, argali sheep, and even smaller creatures such as rabbits, birds, and even insects. But I think some of the most evocative examples of the Scythian art are those that include the representations of the Scythians themselves. And one such object is a bell-shaped golden helmet that was found in Peredrieva Могила in Donetsk region in Ukraine, in eastern part of the Ukraine, which is dated to the 4th century BC. It is decorated with relief figures of Scythian warriors, and there are two groups of these combatants, and in each of them an older bearded man is attacking one kneeling and one standing younger man. These younger men are portrayed as beardless, so that's how we know their age. Their weapons, their scabbards, their swords, and goretoi, these are special containers for bows and arrows that Scythians carried, are shown in great detail. And the whole scene has this distinct freeze-frame quality that something is going to happen, and what is going to happen is not going to be very nice. But setting the violence of the scene aside, these are among the most detailed images of the Scythians we have. All the figures have shoulder-length hair, they wear trousers that are tucked into ankle-length boots, and belted sleeve jackets that extend to mid-thigh, and these jackets have exquisite decorations and trimmings that suggest that they were made of fur, which is, of course, confirmed then by finds we have from Siberian graves where organic materials survive.
The golden age of the Scythians was between the 8th and 4th centuries BC, when they mainly inhabited the broad arc of the steppe between the Dnieper River in Ukraine and the Ural River much further east in Kazakhstan. But to understand the origins of the Scythians, we need to go another 2,500 kilometers east to the mountains and valleys of the Altai, a mountainous range in southern Siberia where the borders of Russia and Mongolia, China and Kazakhstan meet. So, Barry, explain to us the significance of the Altai for the Scythians.
Well, the Altai Mountains, the Altai and Sayan Mountains, are a complicated mountain range with sort of intermontane plateaus with rivers running through them. And these are plateaus of wonderful grassland, steppe grassland, where people lived. What is very important, I think, is that somewhere around the 10th century BC, there was a major change in climate. Climate had been fairly cold and dry, which meant life was quite hard and society was comparatively simple. But somewhere around the 10th century, 10th to 9th century, the climate became much moister and rather warmer. And therefore, grass grew more, the biomass increased, population could increase because the holding capacity of the land allowed it. And this gave people a greater freedom, I think, to move. They weren't tied to food production. Food was moderately more easy to get, so they had more time to go off and raid and develop other aspects of society. So I think a little change in the climate sort of kick-started a kind of society that was more and more mobile. It was more and more predatory. People started to raid, and this certainly shows in the artefacts of the time. Even in the 10th, 9th century here, you find all the classic weapons of the Scythian world, the arrows, the short swords, and the battle axe, and they're all there, so it suggests that society is really becoming quite rough and nasty. And it is, I think, in that context that we see disparity in wealth appearing. Before that, there wasn't a great deal of variety in the status of the individuals. But from that time onwards, you get much richer and richer and richer burials appearing. So there was a big social change there, and that sort of tipped over and gave rise to the kind of society, I think, that we call Scythian, that stretches really from this area right across really to the Great Hungarian Steppe.
And the other thing about the Altai, being mountainous, is that it had a much colder climate than the Pontic steppe. So the contents of these kurgans were sometimes preserved at near freezing temperatures, even in the summer. And this meant that when they were unearthed, even organic tissues were found to be perfectly preserved. And it's produced an extraordinary treasure trove of material, which has delivered important new insights about the Scythians. Hermann, you've excavated some of these sites. What were the most important finds, and what did they tell us about the lives of the people who were buried there?
Well, this is true. In the Altai Mountains, in the permafrost region, there are fantastic finds. And these finds, they preserve almost everything. You must imagine that in the burial chamber, water gathers and the water gets frozen, and this normally already the first year. Then it's like an ice block where everything is preserved. And this really turns archaeology into ethnography. I was lucky that in 2006, in a Russian-Mongolian-German cooperation, we worked on the Mongolian part of the Altai Mountains, about almost 2,500 meters high, and we opened such a ice grave, ice kurgan as they are called, and to explain the situation. I mean, we excavated in June, July, and every day we had some snow. Every day at night it was below zero. And this explains why these things are preserved there. And then when you open it, I mean, you have the mummy, you have the body of the deceased, you have the human skin complete with tattoos which offer a complete different new kind of this animal style. It's a little bit different from other objects, from golden objects and so on. And of course, the first ice kurgan was excavated in the late 19th century by Radloff, then between 29 and the late 1940s. Others at Parzinger and Bajada and so on have been excavated all around the Altai Mountains. And recently others have been excavated. And it's unbelievable. You have carpets, you have chariots. I mean, the body which we excavated, there's a fur coat. The body were trousers. You just had to iron them and you almost could wear them. So well preserved they have been. And of course, what was also very interesting, the whole decoration was preserved by wood. So necklaces with animal-style decorations, very finely carved in wood and then covered with very, very thin golden sheet. So it was not a rich warrior. He could not have a real massive golden necklace. So he had a wooden necklace covered with golden sheet and so on. And these things, normally, if you imagine that you would find such a grave, because if you then reconstruct it, it seems quite a colorful, rich grave. But when you look at that, what you would have found, if it's really down in the plains, you would have found just the dagger, the iron dagger, an undecorated pot, and you'd have said, well, as an archaeologist, you have been very unlucky. It's a very poor grave. But now imagine what you found instead. So this is unbelievable, and this gives such a insight how colorful these graves had, how much information they had originally, but normally the archaeologist has not the organic material and only very few things you get in comparing to such discoveries.
Well, at some point in the early first millennium BC, a lot of the Scythians in Altai seemed to move west. Margarita, do we know why? And particularly, where did they go?
Well, it's still a very difficult question to answer because this move is actually not very well visible archaeologically to us. We see new types of weapons such as daggers and arrowheads and certain types of horse gear appearing around 9th century BC in the Pontic steppe. And this suggests an influx of new people which have been associated with historical Cimmerians, another type of, if we could call them that, of Scythic peoples. But in reality, probably these new weapons represent various nomadic groups that arrived at different points in time and in different quantities.
And this is what a Scythian caravan moving west might have looked like, with many wagons and animals.
The smallest of these wagons have 4 wheels, but some have 6. They are covered with felt, and they are constructed in the manner of houses, some having but a single apartment, and some 3. They are proofed against rain, snow, and wind. The wagons are drawn by yokes of oxen, some of 2 and others of 3, and all without horns, for they have no horns owing to the cold. In these wagons the women live, but the men are carried about on horses, and the sheep, oxen and horses accompany them. And they remain on any spot as long as there is provender for their cattle. And when that fails, they migrate to some other place. They eat boiled meat and drink the milk of mares, and also eat cheese prepared from the milk of the mare.
That's from a book called On Airs, Waters and Places by the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates, written possibly sometime in the 5th century BC. Now, whether or not these Greek writings are reliable, we'll discuss in a minute, but there is evidence that the nomadic tribes from Siberia seem to have had a particularly mobile lifestyle centred on the horse. As we've mentioned, horses were sometimes buried with their Scythian owners. And during their life, a horse and a mounted rider made for a formidable fighting unit. Barry, was this what made the Scythians so feared by the other tribes around them?
I think it was the speed and ferocity of the Scythian movement that caught people unaware. The idea of the horde being able to raid over very, very considerable distances, coming at you when you were least expecting it. We know from various sources how the Scythians, for example, poisoned their arrows, so you didn't want to get a Scythian arrow in you if you could help it. We've got accounts of how the Scythians would ride up to you in a horde and then ride away, and if you chase them, they'd turn around on their saddles and fire arrows back at you, the Parthian shot, as it later became known. So they got this reputation for being fast and furious and unstoppable.
There's some evidence that it wasn't only Scythian men who fought battles, but also women. Margarita, what have the Kurgan finds revealed in this respect?
Well, first of all, actually, Greek sources talk in particular about the women of Zauromatians and other Scythic peoples that inhabited the region between River Don and the Ural Mountains in Russia. Supposedly, they rode on horseback, they wore male clothing, they used bows and javelins, and they could only marry after they have killed a man or 3, depending on the source that you're using. We also know that Persian King Cyrus was killed whilst fighting Massagetai, who were led by a queen, Tomyris. So clearly even Greeks are aware of this. Archaeological evidence does provide some validity to the existence of these female warriors. From the second half of the 5th century BC, we start seeing female burials with weapons. They're not majority, but still, for example, 4 out of 50 warrior graves around one of the large royal kurgans in the Pontic steppe, the Chertom Lik in southern Ukraine, were female. Curiously, though, we have extremely few depictions of Scythian women. They are not depicted by the Greeks, they're not depicted by the Persians, and there are literally a handful of images on Scythian gold objects, and these usually show a seated, what is interpreted as a goddess. She wears a long dress, a very sumptuous headgear, and sometimes holds a mirror or some sort of vessel. So there's this curious inconsistency. On the one hand, women were clearly taking on male roles in Scythian societies, but on the other hand, they are practically invisible in iconography.
Many of the Scythians were accomplished soldiers, so when they arrived in Mediterranean lands and started interacting with the Greeks, especially in the area around the Black Sea where there were a number of Greek colonies, they soon found employment as bodyguards or mercenaries. But while appreciating their skill and strength, the Greeks also seemed to make fun of the Scythians. Tell us why, Margarita.
Well, Greek written sources from historian Herodotus to the playwright Aristophanes perpetuate the stereotype of drunkenness among the Scythians. And the likely reason behind this is that Scythians did not mix wine with water, which was something that Greeks always did. So for Greeks, this seemed like a very barbarian and inappropriate thing to do. And in fact, Scythians were not alone among the ancient peoples to have that reputation among the Greeks. So did the Celts and many of the Germanic tribes, and I'm sure Barry can tell more about that. But wine was an important element of Scythian social rituals. For example, blood brotherhood, when a mixture of wine and blood was drunk from the same vessel by 2 warriors to create a sort of special, unbreakable, sacred bond. Or also for communal consumption of wine by warriors who have slain an enemy. That said, Scythians did know how to throw a good party. If we look at what was consumed at the funeral feast of the royal kurgan of Alexandropol, one of the largest ones ever built. There is evidence for no less than 479 Greek wine amphorae from 13 different Mediterranean centers. And even using minimum calculations, that would amount to about 7,000 liters of wine. And of course, they did not only drink. This was accompanied by about 17,000 kilograms of meat, which suggests the presence of between 4,000 and 6,000 people. So quite a party.
That certainly does sound like quite a party. Hermann, were there other accoutrements which suggest that they were keen on partying?
Well, I don't know if partying is the right word, but of course we know what we mean. And it's clear that many ancient civilizations had enormous feasts, and this phenomena of feasting still starting in the Neolithic and through other periods and in the Scythians are in this tradition in a way. And of course what is important, especially when there's an elite kurgan, it was not just a huge mound and below there's one grave. Before the mound, and this our excavations also showed, before the mound was really built, this was a ritual. This was putting in scene the ceremony of the burial of such elite persons. And for example, in Ajan, one huge kurgan which we excavated from the late 7th century BC in southern Siberia, in Tuva, we had, for example, sacrificial places. So there was a clear planning of building the kurgans. And of course, if you have such an idea that there was first a huge feast, a huge ceremony, processions perhaps, then you understand why these 400 and something amphoras of wine and all these things, they are just part of one huge ceremony, which is very important. And the monumentality of the kurgans, of the burial mounds, corresponds to the monumentality of the ritual.
And this is what that Greek historian Herodotus had to say about the feasting, which accompanied the burials of even ordinary Scythians.
When one of them dies, his nearest of kin lay him upon a wagon and take him round to all his friends in succession. Each receives them in turn and entertains them with a banquet, during which the dead man is served with a portion of all that is set before the others. This is done for 40 days, and afterwards the burial takes place.
Barry, there's also some evidence, isn't there, of them inhaling hemp smoke and drinking some kind of opiate. Was this unusual at the time?
I don't think it was unusual at all, no. Herodotus, in fact, talks about inhaling hemp smoke when he gives this wonderful description of the burial ritual of a chief. You've just heard a part of it. And he says at the end they purify themselves by making a tent of poles and skins and having a burner, bronze burner in it with hot coals and pouring hemp seeds on it and getting inside and inhaling the fumes and getting quite wild as the result of it. But he presents it rather as a ritual to purify you at the end of the burial. And in the Parziric burials, one finds that actual equipment, these poles to make the tent and the little burner, the bronze burner. There's even the burnt stones on it and even the charred hemp seeds. And there's a little leather flask containing hemp seeds. So you've got Herodotus on the one hand, the archaeology on the other, building up to that story. There's also a new, comparatively new excavation at Stavropol in Russia, North Caucasus, found, I think, in 2013, where they found gold vessels, beautifully decorated gold vessels, with residue of opium and cannabis in it. And they think the opium was being brewed as a drink for the burial rite. Now, I don't think this is at all surprising, because people throughout the world, understand herb law.
And Margarita, at a time when the Greeks and many other people around the Mediterranean wore some type of skirt or loose covering on their legs, the Scythians much preferred tailored trousers. Why was that, do you think? This included the women too, didn't it?
That's right. And indeed, Greeks and other Mediterranean cultures would wear what we call a woven-to-shape garment. So these would be woven on the loom and then draped around the body with various sort of devices like belts and pins and buttons, where Scythians had tailored garments. And trousers are effectively a defining visual characteristic of Scythians in Greek, Persian, and even in Scythian iconography in art. Trousers are, of of course, a perfect garment for horse riding, particularly if we're thinking climates where the cold winters preclude going bare-legged. For example, in Mongolian steppe, even today, the winter temperatures can plunge down to minus 45. So you need some sort of cover. You won't survive very long without covering your entire body. And in fact, trousers likely developed as a horse riding outfit in Central Asia. Our earliest evidence of trousers comes from China, from Yanggai Cemetery in the Turpan Basin in western China. And they date to the period between 13th and 10th centuries BC. Of course, these are not the earliest trousers. These are the earliest ones we have archaeologically. And they're already in pretty well-developed state, if we could call it that. They're made of wool and have straight legs and quite wide crotches, making them ideal for horseback riding. And if we look at the trousers found in the Scythian graves in Pazyryk and the Kok Plateau that Hermann mentioned, these are dating 6th, 7th centuries later, but they're almost identical. And of course, besides wool, they would have been using leather, and we have evidence for that as well.
In addition to the Scythians' main migration west to the Pontic steppe in modern-day Ukraine, other Scythian groups went south over the Caucasus Mountains into what is now modern-day Iraq, and there's even evidence that in 612 BC they were present at the destruction of the great Assyrian city of Nineveh. And it seems that their travels through the lands of Asia Minor and the Mediterranean may even have taken them as far south as Egypt. What do we know about that, Barry?
The Scythians were in an active relationship, really, with the Assyrians, and really helped the enemies of Assyria sort of bite away slowly at the Assyrian world. But they used it really as an opportunity for raiding and doing all the things that Scythians were good at doing. And at one stage, they did make this sort of major move right across and to the edges, to the fringe of Egypt. And they were essentially bought off by the Pharaoh and asked to go back. And horse riders are mentioned actually in the Bible, in Jeremiah. And then there is this wonderful story that Herodotus tells again, and there are other sources for it, which says that some of them were there for a 28-year period, which is quite a long time, and then decided to go back home, that is, go through the Caucasus to the steppe on the northern side of the Caucasus. And when they got home, these sort of hoary, battle-scarred old warriors got there. They found that their wives had married the slaves and had produced children. And the boys of this marriage objected to these old men coming back, and there was a big fight. And this is possibly sometimes depicted in artworks, the old fighting the young, and the old men won. You know, it may only be a story, but it may be a reflection of what was happening, that people, Scythians from the north of the Caucasus, were taking time off to go south and fight and loot and pillage and come back again. And they also brought back craftsmen, almost certainly, because we see the influence of Assyrian and Urartian design on some of this Scythian metalwork. So they were interacting with their neighbours in a fairly aggressive way.
Herodotus includes long lists of other tribes who were said to inhabit the areas on the fringes of Scythian territory, and we know from other writings that Scythians were known by half a dozen other names, but we can't be sure what they called themselves because they left us no written text, nor do we know how united they were as a society. But Barry, what's remarkable is that things like the gold objects associated with Scythians, they often look remarkably similar, don't they, with similar decoration, even though they might have been found thousands of kilometres apart. How are we to understand this apparent cultural uniformity over such vast distances?
Well, I think we have to go back to geography here, that the lands that we're talking about for much of the Scythian area are steppe land. There's this grassland, this open grassland, which runs as a great long carpet from Manchuria right across Central Asia, past the Caspian Pontic steppe, and little lumps of it occur over the Carpathian Mountains in Hungary, in the Great Hungarian Plain. And ideas are very easily exchanged over very, very large areas. You must remember, I think, that if you started off as a rider in the Hungarian plain, say early spring, you could end up in Mongolia probably before winter set in. So although the distances are vast, on a horse you can move fast.
Margarita, another set of artefacts that are remarkably similar across the Scythian territory are the many carefully carved standing stones, or stellae, often found near the burial sites. What do we know about them?
Yes, there are about 100 of these stone monuments that are known, and the distribution ranges roughly from Caucasian region to the east of Romania, and they date between 7th and 4th centuries BC. They are effectively life-size depictions of human form. They're sort of roughly carved, usually in granite or limestone, and they probably would have originally marked aristocratic kurgans. They hold weapons, in particular the short Scythian sword, akinakis, which is usually suspended from a belt, and goritos, the arrow and bow holder. They usually wear a torque on the neck. They have mustache and a beard, and often they also hold a rhyton or a drinking horn in their right hand, sort of going back to this idea of drinking being important ritual aspect of Scythian societies. Now, these sculptures are quite important because, unlike many of the gold objects that we've been discussing, which were likely created by Greek craftsmen, these were made by Scythians themselves and therefore reflect really the elements that were important to them. So in a way, they're kind of Scythian selfies in modern parlance. And they also allow us to tie the Scythians to their eastern origins to some extent, because stone carving, the so-called deer stones, are well known from the Bronze Age, from 2nd millennium BC and the early 1st millennium BC in Mongolia, Altai, and Kazakhstan. And another interesting element, some of these stones have animals carved on their shoulders, and these have been interpreted as tattoos, not dissimilar to the actual tattoos found in the frozen burials of Altai.
Well, about 2,200 years ago, the distinctive Scythian culture mostly disappeared from the steppe area in southern Ukraine. Do we know what happened, Hermann?
Well, what we know is that the Scythians have been followed by the Sarmatians in southern Ukraine. But what really happened, how this transition is to understand, this is one of the mysteries, because we have, for example, in the 4th century BC, a really flourishing Scythian culture. We have all these huge elite burials, huge kurgans, especially in the lower Dnieper region, but dating to the 4th century BC. But the earliest Sarmatian graves we have from the 2nd and then 1st century BC. So what happened in the 3rd century BC is still an open question. We hardly have complexes or inventars which can contribute to this period. So there's a gap in between. But I think around 200 BC, when you watch the development all over the Eurasian steppe belt, there was a huge change. Because, for example, we have in the Minosins Basin, the Tagar culture, which was in a way contemporaneous and related to the Scythians, but not Scythians. But there was a change also about 200. There came from the south new groups, new populations immigrated from the south, the so-called Xiongnu, which in a way are identified with the Huns of later period, but this cannot be sure. Then also, for example, the Sakas in southeastern Kazakhstan have been followed in the same period by the Wusun and so on. So it seems to be really a huge change in the whole steppe belt of Eurasia. Maybe it has to do something with the Western Han dynasty in the late 3rd century. This was for the first time that China was really unified and expanding towards the north, expanding through Fergana into Central Asia. And maybe it pushed groups which have been living in these areas and they pushed others. So a kind of chain reaction. But of course the following cultures, as the Sarmatians, there are traditions in the way of living, in the art. There are changes, huge changes, but also traditions from the former period. But the Scythians disappeared.
Well, we're nearing the end of this forum from the BBC World Service, so I just finally want to ask all three of you, briefly, if you had to choose one thing